Alrighty, history fans, welcome to another exciting edition of History 114, and welcome to the second part of our two-part look at emancipation, the key development within the war years themselves. In the second lecture, we're going to continue to describe the slow but continuing process by which the war shifts from one to preserve the Union to one to end slavery. And at the end of this lecture, we'll talk about some of the consequences of that to anticipate for the remainder of the class. One key point I attempted to express in our first lecture on emancipation is that the very first emancipators were the slaves themselves, who took advantage of the exodus of white men to the battlefront to run away. We discussed earlier in the class that running away as a form of resistance is constant throughout the history of slavery in America, but the Civil War offered greater opportunities to run away, a greater likelihood that those efforts would succeed. And so when the war begins and you have this mass exodus of white men, the disciplinary apparatus, the enforcement arm of slavery, no longer on site near plantations, that creates great opportunity, and enslaved people do not wait for politicians in Washington. They take this opportunity into their hands and they make their way into Union lines, seizing this opportunity. We have to, again, use our historical imagination to really understand how profound and remarkable this is. We again have hindsight. We know that eventually the war will be won to end slavery. That war will be successful. And in April of 1865, slavery will end. But those people living through this experience in 1861, 1862 don't have that assurance. They don't have the benefit of hindsight. In fact, as we talked about in our first lecture on emancipation, there's every reason for them to fear being pressed back into slavery. And yet, despite those fears, they insisted again on their freedom, and that's why they should be recognized as one of the, if not the most important factor in the shift towards emancipation. Entire families fleeing plantations, seizing this moment. They had long aspired to opportunities to escape, and now that opportunity was at hand and they weren't going to let it slip away. They made their way into contraband camps, and we spent some time in our first lecture describing those, and they too agitate our historical imagination to imagine what that was like for both the escaped enslaved people and the white northerners who encountered them. We talked about how they became really interesting experiments in the first opportunity for whites and blacks to live side by side. As part of that process, they were often, the escaped enslaved people, conduits of information. They had fled from the South, and they often informed northern soldiers about local geography, places to find water, where Confederate troops may be stationed. And this too worked to break down prejudice and bigotry among the Northerners who harbored racist beliefs themselves, who may only know African Americans and slavery from racist caricatures expressed in minstrel shows. In this case, a black person saved your life. In this case, the knowledge that an escapee could impart to Union soldiers might prevent them from dying, being captured. They offered key intelligence that played a role in the success of Union forces and undoubtedly saved the lives of many white soldiers. So here was another opportunity that came from the close interaction between Northerners and these escaped enslaved people. Here's another example of how people whose names are lost to us in the historical record, who don't get monuments on the mall, whose birthdays we don't celebrate, were key figures in the Civil War era who did small things that made a big difference, did small things that may have influenced the course of the war. Here's a good example of how these people born into slavery, insisting on their freedom, fleeing and making their way in the hopes of being free, these first emancipators also played a key role in the military success of the Union Army. Now again, their names are lost to us. They're not part of the historical record, but we need to rightfully recognize this contribution to the Civil War era. In a smaller sense, and an even more micro sense, if you were a white northerner who benefited from this intelligence, who may have indeed had their life saved, this again was a key moment to confront prejudices that many northerners harbored. And that will be important in the aftermath of the Civil War, the abolishment of slavery, and the debates that circulate regarding the status of former slaves. Could they be voters and citizens of this nation? Well, breaking down racist attitudes would be crucial to helping advance that new status as voters and citizens. So the first emancipators, the enslaved themselves, who in 1861, 1862, when the war is going so terribly for the North, are making their way into Union lines and forcing this issue. An issue that Lincoln and many other Republicans and members of the federal government want to avoid for all the reasons we talked about. Though this is the era of Southern ascendance and the South is winning every major battle, there's a sense within the South that because of this widespread running away and the resistance to slavery among the enslaved, that they were losing the very thing they were fighting for. One plantation owner in Louisiana in 1862 remarking about this process of resistance of enslaved people emboldened those who had run away or stayed on the premises and were now refusing to work, realizing that they had the numerical advantage with this exodus of white men. One plantation owner in Louisiana in 1862, when the war is going so well for the South, says that slavery is, quote, destroyed and worthless. Like you could never put back in place the disciplinary apparatus, the fear and terrorism that made slavery possible now that enslaved people have had this chance to be bolder, more defiant. So though the South is winning the war, many Southerners began to question what they were actually winning if slavery was, quote, destroyed and worthless, if the taste for freedom, opportunity, greater, again, boldness in their demands for wages and overall assertiveness was now common among the enslaved. How could we ever return to where we were before the Civil War began? So, in these lectures, we are telling the story of emancipation, the improbable shift in the war from a war to preserve the Union and stop secession to a war to end slavery. It is the great revolutionary shift in the war. It's why, in part, the Civil War is so important and significant in American history. It is why many scholars call this the Second American Revolution. It is a great shift, therefore, in the totality of American history. We are working to understand how this happens. Part of the reason is, again, the reason that we talked about in our very first look at the war itself, the victories of the South, which makes this a desperate concern for Lincoln, one in which he's willing to change the focus of the war from a war against a Southern army to one against a Southern society. But the other factor that we can now understand in the story of emancipation, the insistence of the enslaved themselves who wanted to be free and weren't waiting for politicians in Washington. What is the impact of this on whites in the South? Well, here again, some of the labor, the work we did earlier in the class is very helpful. We talked a lot about slave society. We talked a lot about how, for white Southerners, their value system, their sense of what is good, natural, just, their sense of morality, what is right and wrong, and their sense of freedom was defined through slavery. So to see slavery unraveling from within, to countenance African Americans insisting on their freedom or being assertive and defiant, well, it really proves to be a blow against those values, those ideals that Southerners were invested in. And so the insights that we developed earlier, that slavery is more than just an economic system, more than just a labor system, really helpful to us now in understanding the psychological blow and trauma this would inflict upon anxious slaveholders in the South, because they were so invested in slavery as something central to their identity. To see it unravel like this was extremely traumatic. And this is in part why Lincoln realizes that if he targets the South at its core, at its values, as its very foundation centered on slavery, he can do that sort of damage that will again shift the tide in the war. So even prior to the war, throughout the history of slavery in the South, there was all this anxiety about slave rebellion, slave resistance. In many parts of particularly the Cotton Belt, whites were outnumbered. There were more African Americans, enslaved people, than there were whites, and that always led to great fear. But now there's even fewer white men, and that really agitates those already existing fears. They attempted to respond to this resistance in a variety of ways, tightening slave patrols, making slave patrols compulsory for white men who weren't in service. As I mentioned, moving slaves to Texas. This is why it is slaves in Texas who are the last to hear about their freedom in June of 1865, months after the South's surrender. That's because so many slaves were sent out to Texas in an effort to hold them into slavery, and it wasn't until much later after the surrender that Union troops reach those enslaved people on that day that we now celebrate as Juneteenth. Many enslaved people were forced out to Texas in an effort to prevent them from running away. The idea here was if they were in a strange landscape that they were unfamiliar with, they would be less likely to run away. It would discourage running away. Also, many enslaved people were taken to hill territories in North Mississippi and other hilly regions of the South, also in an effort to discourage them from running away. And if this didn't work, outnumbered, fearful whites employed a strategy that had also been employed throughout the history of slavery to discourage runaways: terrorism. They would attempt to terrorize enslaved people by telling them scare stories about what would happen if they headed to the north, that they would be beaten or raped or just simply forced back into slavery. So why run away when you're better off here? So that too was a desperate effort employed by slaveholders who again are acutely feeling the anxieties associated with being outnumbered in this way. Many slaves ran away, and they certainly deserve our recognition as the first emancipators, but many others remained for reasons that also we talked about earlier in the class. Running away was dangerous. Running away could invite all sorts of reprisals, from beatings to being sold away from your family. So there's some very smart reasons why enslaved people did not run away. But even those who remained undermined slavery in various ways. We talked about this as well earlier in the class. Strategies of silent sabotage, other forms of resistance. Well, that amplified in the Civil War. So it's another example of how trends that were in place before the Civil War do indeed amplify in terms of running away, but also in acts of resistance, demanding wages, refusing to work. These were other ways in which enslaved people targeted slavery well before the Union Army and the Lincoln government. So this is why a plantation owner in Louisiana, during a period where it looks like the South is about to win, could remark that slavery was destroyed and worthless. Enslaved people remained subject to being forced to labor in fields, growing cotton for the revenue that the Confederacy needed. They were forced into various forms of service in the war effort, attending to Confederate soldiers who were wounded, serving as cooks and other forms of support staff. But even in those opportunities, there was a chance to resist slavery. And so again, here is clear evidence of the way in which enslaved people are responding to the opportunities that the Civil War offered through resistance. And if you tack back to what we talked about earlier in terms of the psychological profile of white Southerners and what they're invested in, you can really start to understand how debilitating this could be to their psyche and sensibilities. To now have people they see as inherently inferior, people who are forever to be below them, resisting their enslavement and standing up assertively against whites in the South. And this is one of the reasons why Lincoln will realize that if he targets slavery, if he further encourages slaves to run away, if he welcomes African Americans into the Union Army so they can hold a rifle and aim it at white men who saw African Americans as inferior, because so much is at stake, because there's a lot of psychological import here, Lincoln realizes that if he turns the focus to ending slavery, it will only further this anxiety, fear, and deal great damage to the South. So, well before the Emancipation Proclamation, well before the 13th Amendment, well before the surrender at Appomattox, even at a time in which the war is going so terribly for the North, slavery was already unraveling. And why is it unraveling? The enslaved themselves. They insisted on their freedom. This is a good corrective to so many misunderstandings about the Civil War era. Think back to our first lecture where we talked about how for so long, not only was slavery downplayed in its role in the Civil War, but there's very little interest, attention given to the role that African Americans played in this history. They were ignored. They were not seen as historical actors. When you change your perspective and include African Americans as causal figures in the Civil War era, you can start to see them as key contributors to this history, and key contributors not just to this moment in American history, but people who stood up to make America again a more free nation throughout our history, not just in this moment of the Civil War. Let's now talk about another factor that must be recognized in terms of why the war shifts to being one to end slavery, and that is the role of the radical Republicans. Now, earlier we talked about how the Republicans are a party that emerged in the 1850s dedicated to stopping the expansion of slavery, and we worked really hard to understand that party as not an abolitionist party, but one committed to that notion that slavery goes no further. But within the Republican Party, there were some abolitionists who wanted to infiltrate the party and pull it towards their agenda of abolition. So, though overall the Republican Party was not an abolitionist party, though the party platform and its major candidates ran with that free soil, free labor ideology, within the party were some abolitionists who believed that the Republican Party is their only vehicle through formal party politics and institutions of power to advocate for and advance the cause of abolition. We talked about Charles Sumner earlier in the class, the man who was attacked on the Senate floor by Preston Brooks. Charles Sumner was a radical Republican. He was an abolitionist. We're going to talk a lot for the rest of the class about Thaddeus Stevens, a representative from Pennsylvania, also an abolitionist. They were members of the Republican Party, and they joined that party to try to harness its institutional power towards their radical agenda, and so they were known as the Radical Republicans. And they are another factor in an effort to shift the war from one to preserve the Union to one to end slavery. So we have the context of the war, the victories for the South, that era of Southern ascendance. We have, as we've now testified in many, many slides, the insistence on the enslaved, another factor that emerges now as key to pushing Lincoln towards this radical step of emancipation. Radical Republicans, men like Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, members of the Republican Party who were lifelong abolitionists, who in the 1830s, 1840s, joined the abolitionist movement, true believers, people who believed that slavery was inherently evil, a stain upon our soul, one that must end now, not over time, not gradually. And also, they believed that once we end slavery, we could become a new nation, reborn, resurrected, where blacks and whites are equal. And when the Republican Party forms the 1850s, though it was not an abolitionist party, they joined that party in an effort to try to make it an abolitionist party. And so now the small group of radicals within the Republican Party are a force upon Lincoln, urging Lincoln to take up their agenda and turn the focus of the war towards ending slavery. Thaddeus Stevens was a representative from Pennsylvania, and he is perhaps, of the politicians of this age, and perhaps any age in American history, the fiercest believer in American ideals of liberty and freedom for all. Thaddeus Stevens saw all human beings as endowed with natural rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. A lot of Americans don't know about Thaddeus Stevens. They look at this weird 19th century name Thaddeus and they go, who the hell was that, right? And that's a shame. We have monuments to Washington. We have monuments to Jefferson. We have monuments to men who were slaveholders, who in many ways compromised our notion of liberty and freedom for all. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence with its phrase, all men are created equal, but Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. So most Americans are familiar with Washington, Jefferson. They get monuments. They're on our currency. But they didn't truly believe in equality and freedom for all. If you want to believe America is a beacon of freedom and democracy, we should celebrate Thaddeus Stevens because he was an American who truly believed that for everyone. Not only was he an abolitionist who called for the immediate end of slavery, he also was a feminist who believed that women should have the right to vote, women should be equal in American life. So he was a true believer in human equality. And he was really good at making that argument. He had this very passionate style of speaking. On the floor of the U.S. House, early in the war, he took to the floor of the House and said, now is the time to target the South at its core, at its heart. Now is the time to end the evil of slavery. Our goal should be, he said, to free every slave, slay every traitor, burn every rebel mansion. Total war. Target the South at its heart. Free every slave. Emancipation. Slay every traitor. He called Southerners what they were, traitors to this nation. Burn every rebel mansion. No restraints, no reservations. Total war. A total war campaigned against the heart of this movement, the Confederacy, slavery. So Stevens was a true believer in human equality. He had fought for it throughout his life, and he wanted to seize this moment. He didn't want this moment to slip away. And he takes to the floor of the House, and he gives these impassioned speeches with this fiery language designed to convince his fellow Republicans to join with him. And now he becomes a force, pressing Lincoln to do what Lincoln had steadfastly refused to do. Now, Stevens was an abolitionist. He was a true believer. He is a very admirable man in the way in which, without reservations, he believed in an America where all men, women, black, white, should be free and equal. But you don't have to be Thaddeus Stevens to be persuaded by his argument. Now, we have talked a lot in this class about how Northerners are not abolitionists. Remember, abolitionists, small group, radical group, fringe group, hated in the North. We've talked about how Northerners were committed to economic concerns in their effort to stop the expansion of slavery, not end slavery. So we know now that the majority of Northerners in this period are not abolitionists. They're often just as racist as Southerners. They don't want to end slavery. That's not what they voted for when they voted for Lincoln. But you don't have to be an abolitionist to be persuaded by Stevens. You can be of that majority in the North who wants to win, who wants to defeat the South. And you could agree with Stevens, because what Stevens is offering here is what seems to be elusive for the North: victory. He's saying, if we do this, if we declare total war against the South, if we say emphatically we're going to free every slave, slay every traitor, no reservations, no limits, we're going to wage this aggressive campaign, he's offering you a pathway to victory. And so if you're a Northerner who's not an abolitionist, if you're a Northerner who is not inclined towards ending slavery, if you're a Northerner who's not committed to black liberation, you could still nod your head and agree with Thaddeus Stevens, because he's promising you a strategy that will ensure victory. And that's why the Radical Republicans also become a causal factor in emancipation. They were pestering and pushing Lincoln because they did believe in abolition and all of its ideals. They had lifelong commitments to that ideology. For them, this is the moment. The war's on, and now it's time to fulfill a goal that they had harbored for decades. But you don't have to be Thaddeus Stevens. You don't have to be a lifelong abolitionist to embrace this point of view and agree, yeah, we should do this. We should free every slave, because it will crush the South and secure what Northerners have failed to realize: victory, success. This will hasten the end of the war, and your son will come home alive. So Stevens and his Radical Republicans have an argument, and one that will resonate with Northerners, even if they're not abolitionists. And in this moment, in this context, with everything now that we know about the war in 1862, Congress takes the next step and passes the Second Confiscation Act. The First Confiscation Act we talked about, passed in August of 1861, provided a legal underpinning, a legal sanction for holding enslaved people as contrabands if the person that owned them was involved in the rebellion, the Confederacy. But the First Confiscation Act was very modest because it did not apply to loyal Southerners, and it offered no clarification regarding the status of those who might be held as contrabands. The Second Confiscation Act is a more direct assault on the institution of slavery. It's a step incrementally towards emancipation, because it says any slaves who make their way into Union lines, who are held and confiscated in this way as captives of war, will never be returned to slavery. So this is a significant moment. We're not yet to the Emancipation Proclamation, but we're getting there. Why is this happening? Well, because of all the things that we've now talked about. The insistence of the enslaved. The role of the Radical Republicans waving this banner saying, yeah, let's do this. This is now the time. And reaching out to Northerners who may not be abolitionists, but see it as a pathway to victory. And again, the failures of the Union Army, defeat after defeat after defeat. Let's take it up a notch. Let's now offer a blinking green light to all the enslaved people in the South. If you make your way north, if you survive that perilous journey, and you make your way into Union lines, you will never be a slave again. What is this going to do? It makes it much more likely that enslaved people will run away. They hear about this, and they know that this dangerous effort, if successful, will indeed emancipate them. So this is a key moment, and it comes about for all the factors that we're now talking about. It clarifies the status of what was unclear in the First Confiscation Act, and the new status is one of liberty and freedom. So enslaved people who were already inclined to run away are only going to be more inclined. And what is that going to do? Well, it's going to traumatize the South. It's going to rob the South of its labor source. It's going to undermine solidarity and morale in the South. So this is a product of the war. This is not everyone in the North becoming Thaddeus Stevens. Thaddeus Stevens is still a radical. He's still a marginal figure. But he's making his argument in a context of defeat, of fatigue, of weariness in the North that makes this moment possible. A shift that comes with the Second Confiscation Act. Also, this act would finally end slavery in the nation's capital. And that's significant. The capital of the Union was now a center of abolition. We talked earlier about how in the Compromise of 1850, the slave trade, the buying and selling of human beings, was banned in the nation's capital, as it was so contradictory, such a pall, such a black mark on the nation to have human beings bought and sold in what was imagined to be the capital of democracy in the Western world. But slavery continued to be legal in Washington, D.C. That ends, though, in 1862. Also, Congress passes a resolution saying that all territories in the West will never be open to slavery. That when we defeat the South and the South is returned to the Union, they'll have to accept that slavery will never go any further. Now, this, of course, is in defiance of the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott decision said you can't do that. Any effort to halt slavery is unconstitutional. But we talked about how Republicans say, oh yeah, elect us, and we'll take action like this to make sure that our agenda, the agenda of the majority of people in the North, the majority of people in the nation, prevail. And here was the Republicans paying that off. And this was key because this was a way of bolstering, flagging support for the war in the North. The war has now gone on for more than a year, high casualties, defeat after defeat. This is very taxing and traumatizing to the North. They're supposed to win the war. The war was supposed to be over quickly. Their son was supposed to come home alive after a few weeks, a few months. Now, by 1862, the war has gone on. It's grisly. It's brutal. There's no end in sight. Here was something to fight for. We win, and slavery goes no further. We win, and our agenda prevails. We win, no slavery in the territories. So again, mindful of the fact that most Northerners are not abolitionists. This was a key moment in passing this resolution and paying off those voters who had voted for Lincoln with this agenda, giving Northerners again a vision of the West now free of slavery if they prevail and win. That was key to maintaining that very fragile coalition that Lincoln needs to continue to prosecute this war, particularly as the war becomes so difficult and deadly. But despite this swirl of forces that are urging and compelling emancipation, Lincoln remains reluctant and resistant to such a radical shift. Early in the war, as I mentioned, Missouri, a slave state, had to be forcibly occupied by the U.S. military in order to prevent it from seceding from the Union and casting its lot with the Confederacy. The Republican nominee in 1856 returns to Army service, John C. Fremont, and Lincoln sends him out to Missouri for that necessary detail of occupying Missouri. And Fremont meets resistance because, as I mentioned, Missouri, if it could have, it was not occupied, may have indeed seceded from the Union. Many slaveholders in Missouri felt in league with and solidarity with the South. And so they don't like being occupied by the Union Army. They resent being occupied by an ambassador of the Lincoln government. They feel about Lincoln like most slaveholders and Southerners felt about Lincoln. And so many of them resist the orders of Fremont. They resist this occupation. They would like to secede from the Union. And when they express their resistance, when they prove to be defiant, Fremont says, oh, you don't like being occupied by the Union Army? You don't want to remain part of the Union? Well, I'm just going to free your slaves. To punish and intimidate some slaveholders that were undermining Fremont's efforts, he began to liberate enslaved people in an effort to compel obedience among the slaveholders. Oh, if you don't remain in the Union and remain loyal and accept our control of your state, I'm going to free all your slaves. Lincoln hears about this and freaks out. Oh my God, no, 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 a million times no. And Lincoln dashes off a telegram to Fremont and he orders him to stop emancipating slaves and to force those who have been emancipated back into slavery, to return them to their owners. this is not the Lincoln we think of. This is not the Lincoln in our historical imagination. This is not the Lincoln we celebrate as the great emancipator. In this instance, Lincoln is ordering people who had been freed back into slavery. He doesn't want Fremont to make this a war to end slavery. He doesn't want to antagonize slaveholders in Missouri or the others 3 slaveholding states. He doesn't want to indicate in 1861 that the effort here, the Union Army, is to emancipate blacks. He knows that is a powder keg, that is a controversial issue. And so he orders Fremont to reverse course. But with it comes a very different Lincoln than, again, we hold in our historical imagination, where Lincoln is not only ordering Fremont to stop freeing slaves, he's ordering the slaves that he had been freed back into slavery. During this period, Lincoln, strangely, I don't think any Lincoln scholar has yet really made sense of this. I mean, there are historians who spend their entire lives studying and writing about Abraham Lincoln. And those historians who are Lincoln scholars, who have dedicated their professional lives and careers to studying Lincoln, are still flummoxed by this. It doesn't make any sense. Lincoln, during the Civil War, revives the prospects of colonization. He says that the larger term issue regarding African Americans of this country is to send them to Africa, which is weird because it didn't work in the 1810s and early 1820s. And so it had been thoroughly discredited because African Americans don't want to go to Africa. They have no connection in their own lives to Africa. They want to be free individuals here in America. And so it didn't work. It was a complete bust. But it's also, as I said, the complete opposite of abolition. It's the opposite of our collective image of Lincoln as the great emancipator, because colonization is a statement that this is a country for whites and whites only, to such an extent that we are going to remove from this country Native Americans, like you have with the Trail of Tears in the 1830s, or in this instance, African Americans. Send them to Africa. So it's not Lincoln the emancipator. It's not Lincoln as an abolitionist. It's quite the opposite. He is here endorsing a vision of America that's for whites and whites only. He said we don't need to make this about emancipation because eventually the South will give up slavery. It's not a pressing and moral concern. Abolitionists believed it was a pressing and moral concern as early as the 1830s. They said that every day going forward with slavery is a stain upon our soul. We're all guilty of that sin. Lincoln says we don't need to end slavery now because it'll die out eventually. He again had the confidence that many Northerners had that the North, with its economic system of wage labor industrialization, was the future. And eventually the South, too, will be forced to cleave towards that future. And so he said it's a moot point. We don't need to end slavery. Lincoln was willing to prosecute the war if it didn't mean ending slavery. And he was confident that slavery can go on forward in the South because the tide of history will eventually catch up to the South, and it will too industrialize. So why do something so dramatic, costly, controversial as embrace emancipation if you do believe that it's just a matter of time? In 1862, Lincoln described blacks and whites as separate races in a way that seemed to imply that cohabitation, that living side by side was impossible, that the two were incompatible. So again, it's 1862. It is the year that later he will issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, but months prior, he has a vision of America that's so contrary to abolitionism and the way in which it envisioned a new America, reborn, resurrected, where blacks and whites are equal. What is compelling Lincoln is winning the war and preserving the Union, not abolishing slavery. The reason why he eventually does issue the Emancipation Proclamation is that finally, after the disastrous summer of 1862, after the defeats at Antietam and Fredericksburg, he is finally convinced that the only way to win the war is to indeed target the South at its heart, at its core, slavery. And so for Lincoln, if he could have won the war without targeting slavery, he would have been thrilled and overjoyed to do so because he wouldn't make that radical step with all of its potential to backfire, with all of the potential for divisions in the North, because most Northerners also don't want to fight a war to end slavery. For him, the most important thing is winning the war, preserving the Union. He doesn't want to be the president who goes down in history as the one to preside over the end of the United States as we know it. And he continues through 1862 to prosecute the war with that goal in mind. But by the summer of 1862, he's convinced finally that there's no way to win the war at that point without targeting the South, shifting the war from a war against a Southern army to a war against a Southern society. And so eventually, the reluctant emancipator makes this fateful and desperate decision, throws this Hail Mary pass designed to change the course of the war in its first year and a half and salvage the prospects of victory in the face of coming defeat. Why does Lincoln do what he does? Well, we've enunciated a number of factors. The military setbacks, the defeat, the crushing psychological blow those defeats bring in a North that was convinced early in the war that this will be over quickly. Doesn't go that way. He's seen as inept in his efforts to prosecute the war. Why can't we win? We have more people, more money, more guns, more factories. Lincoln is aware of that restiveness and anger in his coalition of Northerners. So that era of Southern ascendance causal here. There is the insistence of the enslaved themselves. That problem is not going away. More people are now going to make their way into Union lines, not waiting for Lincoln. There's Thaddeus Stevens and these vexatious, troublesome radical Republicans who are on the floor of the House and Senate each and every day demanding that Lincoln does this because it's the only way to win the war, convincing some with that passionate, inspiring rhetoric. And then there's an international factor that we have yet to state, but it needs to be recognized as very instrumental, very causal in what Lincoln does. In late 1862, when it looks like to the United States and the world that the South is about to win, Great Britain begins to give indications that it is willing to recognize the Confederacy, meaning it will recognize that the Confederacy exists, that those 11 states are now a separate sovereign nation, recognize it diplomatically, recognize the Confederate States of America, and lend its considerable military power, including its navy, to the Confederacy to win its independence from the United States. The United States produced 75% of the global supply of cotton. Most of that went to Great Britain. And that cotton fueled the British economy. Great Britain had close ties to the South as a result. And Great Britain reasoned, look, it's going to happen anyways. We're just going to push it over. And in doing so, establish a very close relationship with the Confederacy as the nation that came to its aid and pushed it over towards independence. Great Britain was the most powerful nation on earth in 1862 and will remain so really until 1945. Its wealth and its military power unrivaled. And so if it did enter the war on the side of the South, that would be the tipping point, the final straw that broke the camel's back and assure Southern victory. Lincoln could not compete with Great Britain siding with the Confederacy. So if Great Britain does this, it's over. The South will surely win. But Lincoln realizes that if he changes the objective of the war to one to end slavery, Great Britain cannot do this. Great Britain had already abolished slavery well before the United States. It abolished slavery in its entire empire. That's why when American slaves rise up in rebellion aboard the Creole, 2 years after the uprising aboard the Spanish ship Amistad, and sail that ship, the Creole, into a British possession in the Caribbean, Great Britain has to emancipate them because Great Britain had ended slavery in all of its territories, including its possessions in the Caribbean. So we talked earlier about the Creole, and that was an early indication in the class of this policy of Great Britain. So Great Britain was already on the side of ending slavery. If Lincoln changes the objective of the war to end slavery, Great Britain cannot come into the war to aid the Confederacy. Because then, with the war really about slavery, with slavery on the line, Great Britain could not cast its lot with the Confederacy. If the war remains one that seems to be about the Constitution and the legitimacy of secession, if it remains a war about preserving the Union, Great Britain can enter the war and assure a Confederate victory because slavery is not on the line. But when Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, it is now about slavery. And so the objectives of the war shift, and Great Britain could not, in that context, with that at stake, cleave towards the Confederacy. So what the Emancipation Proclamation did was it got ahead of and prevented British recognition of the Confederacy and British involvement in the war. Today we have this idea of Great Britain as, our close ally, a special relationship. That's a very recent development. Only after World War II have we really had that close connection with Great Britain. For most of our history as a nation, the United States, Great Britain has not been our ally. It's been our great foe. There's a reason why. Soon after the American Revolution, we go back to war with Great Britain in the rematch of the War of 1812. And Great Britain, throughout the 1800s, throughout the 19th century, would prove to be very rivalrous to the United States, including this incident here where it's about to come down on the side of the Confederacy, help destroy the United States. But the Emancipation Proclamation prevented that. So that, too, is a very key factor in explaining why Lincoln does what he does. As we've already said, we'll talk more about Lincoln's decision, though on the right side of history, one that we welcome, one that will win the war. Very, very dangerous. Very, very risky. He is going to own now emancipation. He's going to have to turn to Northerners and say, I want you to fight and die for black liberation. And that's not a popular opinion in the North. And then, as we'll talk about in lectures to come, after 1863, the North deliberately embraces a strategy of high casualties, a war of attrition that says, yeah, we're going to lose a lot of people, but we have more people than you do, so we'll win in the end. So Lincoln is asking Northerners to fight and likely die in a war of attrition for black liberation. That's a hell of a gamble. Lincoln will do this in part because he feared Great Britain coming into the war, helping the South win, and again, seeing himself as the president who presided over the dismantling of the United States. Another factor here is that with the Emancipation Proclamation, it allowed African Americans to serve in the Union Army, and they will serve in numbers over 100,000. And the vast majority of African Americans who serve in the Union Army are former slaves. Free blacks in the North absolutely served, but the majority were former slaves. And so this would really expand and augment the manpower of the North, give them even more advantage by welcoming into the pool of potential soldiers, African Americans. And also, with African Americans serving in the Union Army, my, what is that going to do to the psyche, sensibilities, resolve of white Southerners who now stare across the battlefield and see a black man with a rifle aiming at them? Think about, again, the mentality, the sensibilities of Southerners. They believe in white supremacy, white superiority. They believe that blacks should be forever under the control of whites. That is the sensibility of whites in the South, whether they own slaves or not. Again, the work we did earlier in the class with that concept of a slave society. What is it going to be like for them to see the world turn upside down, to see a black man with a rifle aiming at them? That, too, is a consequence of welcoming African Americans into the Army. Not only would it augment and expand the manpower base of the North, further amplifying the weight of numbers on their side, but the people being welcomed into the Union Army are now African American men, former slaves, who have the opportunity to fight for their freedom, the freedom of millions like them, and aim their rifles at people fighting to preserve slavery. Another factor in Lincoln's decision, why he's willing to take such a gamble, Northerners are increasingly convinced that it's necessary. says here on the slide, changing attitudes in the North. And by that I do not mean now every Northerner is Thaddeus Stevens. This does not mean that every Northerner now is an abolitionist. But as I said earlier, when we talked about abolitionists like Stevens, they were making an argument for total war, targeting slavery, because they were abolitionists and they had long sought to end slavery. But you don't have to be Thaddeus Stevens. You don't have to be a lifelong abolitionist. You don't have to be a radical to say, hell yeah, it's on. Let's target the South at its heart, its core, because we will win. And we're desperate to win in 1862 when the North is facing defeat after defeat. It means the war will be over quicker, and maybe your son, husband will come home alive. So Northerners change their attitudes not by becoming abolitionists, but by realizing that the abolitionists have a point, that the only way to win and ensure victory is emancipation. And so Lincoln, in September of 1862, soon after that string of defeats in the summer of 1862, issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And even now, he's still hoping that he could avoid abolition and ending slavery. The preliminary Emancipation Proclamation said, if you continue to wage this war of rebellion against the United States, effective January 1st, 1863, we now fight to end slavery in states in rebellion. So it doesn't go into effect until January 1st, 1863, and even then it doesn't really go into effect because it only applied to slaves in states involved in rebellion, which is another good piece of evidence for us here that this is about the war. This isn't about Lincoln himself becoming Thaddeus Stevens. It's a wartime strategy by a commander-in-chief desperate for victory. And so the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation makes that argument. If you do not lay down arms, you 11 states that have seceded from the Union, stop this illegal war against the legitimate government of the United States, well, after January 1st, 1863, we are going to fight to liberate the slaves in those states in rebellion. So what Lincoln had hoped was that between September 22nd and January 1st, the South would realize what's now at stake and lay down their arms. So even with the Emancipation Proclamation, he hoped to avoid actually enforcing it. If on December 31st, 1862, the South said, okay, we surrender, we give up in order to preserve slavery, well, we wouldn't have had the Second American Revolution. So what Lincoln was hoping, by issuing this in September, the preliminary status of this, that it would convince Southerners to again lay down their arms and the war and preserve the Union. That's why it is the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Finally, History 114, we're here. We're here to the moment that we hope for, where the war is now won to end slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation again says that after January 1st, 1863, it is a war to liberate slaves in states in rebellion. It is a war to end slavery in those states in rebellion. So we are finally here. But we have to be cognizant again of what this means, not for us, with hindsight looking back, with the moral clarity that we have in the 21st century, but for the Republican Party that is now the party of emancipation. It now owns this. Lincoln owns this. Republican Party, as we talked about, emerged in the 1850s not as an abolitionist party, but as an anti-slavery party, one that argued that slavery goes no further. It won. It made gains. It convinced Northerners because it wasn't an abolitionist party. And now it is a party dedicated to this strategy. It's a wartime strategy. It's a desperate move. It's forced in many ways upon many who resisted it, but it's here now. And so the Republican Party owns it. And though we say, hell yeah, that's the right thing to do, again, it's not a popular opinion. It's not why Northern voters voted for Lincoln, and now it's upon us. The Republicans have to own it in that way. It's a hell of a gamble. It's a hell of a risk. And we know it's going to work. We know it's going to be effective, and we know it's the right thing to do. But in 1862, it's a hell of a gamble for Lincoln and his party. We know how Southerners will respond to this. It won't convince them to lay down their arms. In fact, it will convince them to fight even more intently and intensely. What is it going to do to Northerners? That too is an open question, because this is not what they signed up for. This is not what they elected Lincoln for. And that really speaks to how it is quite a gamble. Let's talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. As I mentioned, it was to go into effect January 1st, 1863. The South doesn't lay down its arms. In fact, it's more convinced than ever to fight for everything it holds dear: slavery, slavery, slavery. It did not apply to those 4 states, slave states that remain in the Union, so-called border or slave states: Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland. It only applied to states in rebellion because, again, this was a wartime action. It wasn't a sweeping effort to free all slaves. It was an effort to change the course of the war by targeting those nations, those states responsible for the war. Because of that, some people sometimes remark that, the Emancipation Proclamation, when it was first issued, didn't free any slaves because it only applied to states in rebellion. Of course, these states in rebellion don't say, well, Lincoln says we have to free all the slaves, right? Of course not. So it would take victory. It would take occupying these states to finally free their slaves. They don't say, well, Lincoln issued this Emancipation Proclamation and now we have to free all you slaves. Of course not. So that's why some scholars or some people say the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free any slaves. It's only when the North wins and occupies the South and enforces this that slaves are freed. But that's not exactly true, because there were parts of the South states that did secede from the Union that were occupied by the North. Islands off the coast of South Carolina, what are known as the Sea Islands. This was part of an early effort in the war to establish a blockade of the Atlantic coast, what was, again, the operation known as the Anaconda Plan, where initially the Union believed they could end the war quickly by blockading the coast and preventing cotton exports. Didn't work too well, as we talked about, because so few of the Navy vessels the United States had in 1861 were steam-powered. It became very difficult to enforce. But in an effort to blockade the coast, they occupied very early in the war some islands off the coast of South Carolina, which are known as the Sea Islands. The Sea Islands were a part of South Carolina, off the coast of South Carolina, the first state to secede from the Union. There on the Sea Islands for many generations, slavery was enforced and practiced. Because they were off the coast of South Carolina, there developed on the Sea Islands unique forms of slavery, unique societies, a unique dialect known as Gullah, spoken by African Americans there. So because they were islands detached physically from the larger state of South Carolina, there's some uniqueness to the Sea Islands. They're occupied, and that meant there's a part of the South, a part of a seceding state, in fact, the first state to secede from the Union that was under Union control. And so on January 1st, 1863, when this policy goes into effect, those slaves were emancipated. And they would be the very first slaves emancipated under the Emancipation Proclamation. So thousands of enslaved people were emancipated on January 1st in the very limited parts of the South occupied by the Union Army, in the very limited parts of these seceding states that had been liberated by the Union. So it's wrong to say the Emancipation Proclamation did not free any slaves. I guarantee those thousands of enslaved people on the Sea Islands were very happy to be told they would never be slaves again. But emancipation for the millions of other enslaved people in parts of the South that were not yet controlled and occupied by the North would have to wait through 1863, 1864, and early 1865. And in April of 1865, the South surrenders, and that meant that all enslaved people would now be emancipated. In January of 1865, even before the South surrenders, the 13th Amendment had been ratified and added to the Constitution. stipulating that all slaves would be freed. And so those 4 slave states that were not subject to the Emancipation Proclamation were indeed subject to the Constitution of the United States, which then, in January of 1865, at the behest of radical Republicans, now contained a 13th Amendment that abolished slavery everywhere in the United States, freeing 4 million human beings. The prospects of that were now at least there. In 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation, what it meant was, if the North wins and does reverse the course of the war and occupy those states in rebellion, the slaves within those states will never be free. The 13th Amendment further clarified that by saying there's never going to be slavery ever again in American history. So this is a key moment where the freedom of 4 million human beings born into slavery is now at stake. We are here, History 114, at an improbable moment. I mentioned this earlier, and it's important to return to, because we could use some hope right about now, right? It's easy to be pessimistic, despondent about the immediate future and maybe the far-flung future in 2020, when it seems like true, progressive, positive change is so elusive. But here, perhaps in the past, we can find some hope. In the 1830s, 1840s, abolitionists emerged, and they said, we're going to end slavery. We're going to end the most powerful, profitable slave regime in human history. We're going to emancipate millions of people whose parents had been enslaved, whose grandparents had been enslaved, whose great-grandparents had been enslaved. That ends. In the 1830s, 1840s, that seemed like an impossible dream, something only possible through the imagination of hope. And yet, these people lived to see it. It will take a ruinous civil war that will take the lives of over 600,000 people to make it possible. It will take the death of so many, even before that, as we saw. It'll take a great struggle, a great fight, but now it's possible. Now that long-standing effort has hope. So when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, what had always been the dream of abolitionists was now there within their grasps. And, as we'll soon see in lectures to come, after 1863, largely because of this shift in strategy, the war will transition, and you'll get the era of Northern ascendance, where the North is winning every major battle, and eventually the South will surrender, and millions of people will be free. So what seemed to be quixotic, impossible, improbable, contrary to centuries of history, was now right there. And though more death, destruction, and misery awaits the country, the North will prevail, and slavery will be abolished. So if today you sometimes rightfully feel as if there's no hope and we'll never see true positive change, that hopes for change that would make America more just, more free, seem to be elusive and difficult to secure, well, take some hope from the abolitionists. When the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s advanced an impossible agenda and yet lived to see it. As profound, significant as the Emancipation Proclamation is in the sweep of the war, and more broadly in the sweep of American history, if this is finally a moment where the federal government is coming down on the side of freeing enslaved people, there are, of course, some limits to this radical and impressive moment. Okay, the war is won now to end slavery in those slaves in rebellion, in those states in rebellion. But if we free those slaves, well, then what? That's the obvious question. And in lectures to come, we'll see how the nation must countenance and face that question. In April of 1865, when the South surrenders, now what? That question is completely unaddressed by the Emancipation Proclamation. What is the status of former slaves? Okay, we're fighting to free them. Well, what's going to happen to them? Are they going to be sent out of the country? That seems to be a possibility. Colonization? Deporting emancipated African Americans? They might be free and no longer subject to slavery, but does that mean they're going to stay here and be potential citizens, voters? Slaves were defined as property. Even Lincoln recognized that early in the war. Okay, if we're going to free enslaved people who are legally defined as property, will the American citizens, who Lincoln recognizes as such, not members of a confederacy, be compensated? That, as we'll see too, is a vexing question facing the nation. Do ex-Confederates who rose up in rebellion, took up arms against the United States to preserve and extend slavery, when slavery is abolished and their assets in their mind, human beings, are free, do they get money? That too, a vexing question. A question that will loom large when the war ends and slavery ends, but one completely unaddressed here. Because the Emancipation Proclamation is not an act of legislation. It's not something passed by Congress. It's not meant to be an exhaustive, complete answer to how we end slavery and how we transition out of slavery. It's instead the desperate action of a wartime president, an executive order issued by Lincoln, applicable only to states in rebellion, designed to change the course of the war. So these larger political issues that will loom large, completely unaddressed here. But one certain and key thing that it does do is allow African Americans to serve in the Army. And in a series of slides, we'll talk about the significance of that. What does this mean for slave owners in the South? Well, now indeed, it's clear that they are fighting to preserve and extend slavery, a slavery that's now targeted. The Army of the Union is no longer an army fighting to preserve the Union. It's an army of black liberation. And as we'll soon see in lectures to come, the tide of the war will shift, and now the North is going to win, battle after battle. The North is going to invade and hold the South. The North is going to free slaves as it enforces the Emancipation Proclamation, soon occupying well beyond those sea islands off the coast of South Carolina. And Southerners are going to see this. A slavery that was already unraveling, even when they're winning, is going to fully collapse when they begin to lose and the North occupies. And again, slavery means more than just an economic system. It means more than just a labor system. It's their very meaning and identity. That's now at stake for Southerners as a result of this development. I want to complete this two-part look at emancipation by now turning our attention to one of the other elements of the Emancipation Proclamation, the way in which it allowed African Americans for the first time in our history to serve in the Army of the United States, to serve in the Union Army. Prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, African Americans could serve in support capacities, but they couldn't actually wear the uniform of the United States of America. With the Emancipation Proclamation, they could. And that was one of the factors in Lincoln's decision to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Not only would this mean more men available to the North, augmenting and expanding their manpower, and that will be crucial, as we'll see, because they will consciously fight in a style of attrition in the latter stage of the war. But there's also the psychological consequences of now allowing black men to hold a rifle, fight for their own liberty by shooting white men in the Confederacy who want to continue to enslave African Americans. So this is one of the key consequences. Now African Americans can serve. And in these slides, we'll talk about that consequence of the Emancipation Proclamation to give you again a more fully fleshed story of the Civil War, the role that African Americans played in the conflict, but also to counter a long-standing historiographic tradition that omits the role of African Americans as, again, figures in our history, causal actors, people who made this nation. There's this long tradition in American historiography and in our historical imagination of not seeing that contribution, on focusing on the contributions of whites only. And this is also a key corrective for where we are in the 21st century, even after these historiographic shifts that have now included the role of African Americans in the Civil War in our history. In the current debates we have about how we remember or misremember the Civil War, in the current debates we have about memorializations and statues. There's a lot of statues in the country to traitors, a lot of statues, state parks, elementary schools, military forts named after traitors to this country. We are increasingly aware of this because they are increasingly the target of a lot of protest. And we debate, should we have a monument to Jefferson Davis? Should we have a monument to Stonewall Jackson, right? But what's missing in that debate is, why don't we have more monuments to the African Americans who served in the war? Why are there so many monuments to traitors, Confederates, and not too many monuments to the hundreds of thousands of African Americans who fought not only for this country, who fought on the right side of the war for the United States, but fought for their own liberation, fought for the liberation of millions like them, and fought to make America what it claimed to be, a free nation. So let's turn our attention to these key figures in our history who have often been ignored. Over 180,000 African Americans would serve in the Army, thousands more in the Navy. Between 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect, and the end of the war, they suffered a very high casualty rate because they were often sent out first. They were considered more expendable than white soldiers. They would die first before whites in order to preserve white lives. Union officers often put them in the front at the beginning of the battle when the Southern opponent was most well equipped and deadly in an effort to preserve white lives. So these soldiers were often the bravest of all because they marched into battle when the battle was the most dangerous. And that explains the very high casualty rate, as well as the tendency of Southerners to target them because of, again, how threatening it was to see a black man on the other side of a battlefield training his rifle at you. And so that too played a role in the tragic high death rates of African American soldiers. There were high death rates overall in the Civil War, for the reasons we talked about earlier, ranging from more deadly weapons to really terrible medical care. But the Americans who died in the largest numbers were African Americans. Vast majority were former slaves. Yes, free blacks, African Americans in the North who had never been enslaved, served, but the vast majority were people who were born into slavery, who escaped from slavery, made their way to the North, and then had this chance. I hope there's a few moments in the class that get you out of 21st century, get you out of wherever you are right now in this moment, and transport you, agitate your historical imagination, demand that you think about what that must have been like. Imagine that. You're born a slave in the 1830s, 1840s. Your parents, grandparents had all been enslaved. You have no reasonable expectation in your life to do anything other than die a slave. You face, from the moment of your birth, based on a physical characteristic, something you cannot control, a lifetime of bondage. But you live through this fateful moment. Civil War breaks out. It improbably, as we've now described, becomes a war to end slavery, despite early in the war a steadfast effort to avoid that. Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, and as part of that, you have a chance to serve. You escape, you make your way to the North, and you have this remarkable moment to wear the uniform of the United States of America and fight for your own freedom and the freedom of millions of people like you. You have a chance to end that cruel system of human bondage and play a revolutionary role in human history. I don't know about you, but I don't think I could ever get my mind around that. I don't think I could ever stop thinking about that, what that must have been like. And that happened not just for one person, not just for a handful of people, for hundreds of thousands of people had that experience. It's mind-boggling. The liberating opportunity that this now presented. Some of you might be familiar with the 1989 film Glory, which starred Matthew Broderick as Robert Gould Shaw, a Union officer who was tasked with the very first, this is the term used, this isn't my term, but this is the term used at the time, colored regiment. Now, black soldiers could fight, but they were held in segregated units. They didn't fight in the same unit as white soldiers. And that will remain the rule in America through World War II. It's not till after 1945 that the U.S. Army is desegregated. So this was a separate unit of African American soldiers, the 54th Massachusetts, a so-called, again, colored regiment. Robert Gould Shaw was a white officer tasked with training this group, the vast majority former slaves, and leading them into battle. And they fought in a key battle, Fort Wagner, and they fought bravely. Many of them died. That's the story of that film Glory, which if you haven't seen, I urge you to see. Not only is it a great movie, it's very compelling, it's just very entertaining, and it's got great performances by so many great American actors. It's also very historically accurate. Now, that isn't always the most important thing in a feature film, a fictional film, or feature film about history, but it is true. And so if you're sort of the punctilious type who are really committed to every detail being true, it satisfies that as well. But Glory is, in popular entertainment and popular public history, a corrective to that long-standing historiographic tradition that omitted African Americans. When the film came out in 1989, there were college-educated film critics at major publications who conceded in their reviews of the film, I didn't know about this. I didn't learn about this in my history class. Nobody told me blacks fought in the Civil War. And this is in 1989. And this is among, again, people who are the highly educated elite film reviewers at the New Yorker or New York Times. So the film in 1989 was still working to break down a lot of misunderstanding, many memory holes. And so it was really a landmark in urging many Americans to be cognizant of the pivotal role that African Americans played. This was the first major battle, Fort Wagner, where African Americans fought, and it was very key in breaking down a lot of racial prejudices among Northerners who believed that blacks could not fight, that they were weak, that they were cowardly. That body of prejudices were deeply challenged by the bravery of the 54th Massachusetts and all African Americans in the Civil War, who are, again, the bravest of all in many ways, because they often faced the deadliest conditions during the war. Let's talk about the soldiers themselves. And again, I don't think it's really possible to really understand how remarkable this moment was. What a liberating experience it would be to be able to wear the uniform of the United States and fight for your own freedom. After the Civil War, those who served often emerged as political leaders in the post-Civil War South. In our final lectures, we'll talk about the aftermath of the war, Reconstruction. We'll talk about this brief and remarkable period with the 14th and 15th Amendments, where black men, at least, could vote, and former slaves being elected to state houses, 14 former slaves being elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, 2 former slaves serving as senators from Mississippi, a former slave briefly serving as governor of Louisiana. Yeah, that's going to happen, and we're going to see it. It's sadly, tragically, extremely brief, but it happens. After the Civil War, there's this brief moment of great promise and hope for abolitionists who wanted to accomplish their second goal, create a new America where blacks and whites are equal. And as part of that, the voting right franchise was established for African Americans. And they tended to vote for African Americans who had served in the war. This is a big trend in American history for all Americans. This idea that military service often indicates a fitness, a preparation for political service. I mean, this goes back to our first president, George Washington. And up until very recently, we tended to elect war heroes, generals, as president. And African Americans, as Americans, were deeply touched by that sensibility, and they too elected war heroes. And so those who served would continue to serve after the war as the political leaders in the sadly, tragically brief moment where African Americans could vote in the aftermath of the Civil War and serve in these capacities. Again, the Army was segregated. It will remain segregated for the next 80 years. African Americans were often paid less than white soldiers. Sometimes those prejudices against them prevailed, and they were denied a chance to fight because many white Northern officers believed that they were incapable of fighting despite their valor and bravery. They faced very dangerous conditions. If captured, they would likely be mistreated, abused, even killed by Southerners, who, of course, were extremely troubled by this development of African Americans serving in the Union Army and fighting for the end of slavery. So I mentioned earlier that you can make a good argument that African Americans who served in the Civil War were the bravest soldiers of all. They definitely deserve a monument, many of them, because they were so brave, because they're often sent out first when the Southern Army was most equipped and ready to fight. But they're also brave because if captured, they would not be granted the treatment that white Northern soldiers would receive from Southerners. Instead, they were abused because white Southerners didn't see them as fellow soldiers, but saw them, again, as inferior. There's an incident that occurs in 1864 where a Confederate officer, Nathan Bedford Forrest, ordered a group of African American soldiers who surrendered and expected to be treated as prisoners of war. He ordered them summarily executed on the spot in what became known as the Fort Pillow Massacre, one of the great atrocities in American history. So that demonstrates what African American soldiers were facing. If they were captured, if they surrendered, they could be executed. Nathan Bedford Forrest was the officer who ordered that. Nathan Bedford Forrest, after the Civil War, will found one of the very first chapters of the Ku Klux Klan. There are statues to Nathan Bedford Forrest. There's a bust of him in the state capital of Tennessee. There is a state park in Tennessee named after Nathan Bedford Forrest. Until very recently, there was an elementary school in Florida named Nathan Bedford Forrest Elementary. Imagine being an African American who has to send your kid to that school every day. So we don't have monuments to black soldiers. We have monuments to Forrest. Yeah, it's a Civil War that hasn't quite ended. One other consequence of African Americans serving is it broke down a lot of the prejudice of another American, Lincoln, who would get these dispatches, get these telegrams from his military brass, from officers who said these African American soldiers are fighting bravely, they're incredibly capable, and that changes Lincoln. Look, there's a revolution in the course of the war that we're describing right now. The shift from a war to preserve the Union to one to end slavery. I've tried in these lectures to also indicate how that shift is also a broader shift in the totality of American history, Second American Revolution. We're going to see, again in this class, the end of slavery. We're going to see briefly a period where former slaves are elected to high offices in this country. In a smaller sense, there's a revolution within Lincoln. He goes from the guy talking about colonization and separate races to, in his final speech, soon before he's assassinated, coming out in favor of African American men having the right to vote. And one of the factors that clearly shifted Lincoln's sensibility about the fitness of African Americans to vote, to be citizens, was their fitness on the battlefield. When he gets these dispatches and he's being told by his officers, these soldiers are capable, brave, loyal, patriotic Americans. Well, that opens up the opportunity for Lincoln to shift his sensibilities to such an extent that in his final speech before he's assassinated, he'll come out in favor of black male suffrage. So, in these final slides here, I've done my best in the brief time we have to testify to these heroes of the Civil War, many of whom, again, we forget, who don't appear in the iconography of the Civil War era. Instead, we have monuments to traitors. And hopefully this helps you understand the significance of a movie like Glory. It helps you understand a different way of thinking about not just the Civil War, but the causal, instrumental role that African Americans have played in our history. African Americans have fought in every war, from the Revolution through the still ongoing war in Afghanistan. Why are there so few monuments to them and so many monuments to Confederates? We're about to, in lectures to come, talk about the great shift in the war after 1863 as we march towards the end of the war, Appomattox. In our lectures to come, we're going to talk about the road to Appomattox, the road to the end of the war, and why that happens. So we're at a turning point, and emancipation is that turning point. The Emancipation Proclamation further encouraged slaves to run away. It told them, if the North wins, you'll never be a slave again, and you have a chance to fight for your own freedom. It prevents Great Britain from entering the war. Great Britain, maybe right on the cusp, backs down and says we can't enter a war on the side of preserving slavery, and that too is a key factor here. African Americans enlist in the Union Army. They sacrifice, they serve, they augment the manpower needs of the North when it needs more people in this desperate time. And there's that psychological trauma. One more note, though, about emancipation as this turning point and why it proves to be so consequential in ushering in the great shift in the war and its profundity and significance. One very clear consequence of the Emancipation Proclamation is now the Northern Army is an army of black liberation. And that means that every victory going forward is not just a victory against the Confederacy, not just a victory against secession, not just a victory to preserve the Union. Every victory the North will now rack up is a victory in the cause of black liberation. And in lectures to come, we're going to see those victories. They're coming. We're going to see the North increasingly invading and occupying the South. We're going to see General Sherman march from the Mississippi to the Atlantic, freeing slaves. We're going to see what has already begun intensify, the unraveling of slavery. And Southerners are going to see it. They're going to witness it. A world turned upside down. So hopefully these last two lectures have helped you understand how we got here, how improbably the war does shift to being one to end slavery. And now, going forward, we can see the consequences of that for the war and the totality of American history.